Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout free, which I was very happy to see that you didn't have those issues you had in Google Hangout 2 with a lot of technical static and echo and stuff like that. So you worked it out and I was glad to see that. The only thing with the camera view, I was having Ubaldo in the main screen all the time. So for the last Hangout, tried to alternate and actually highlight the person that is speaking, because it's then easier to focus on that person and you don't get that breakdown of switching back and forth, and it just helps with the flow. I've got to address an elephant in the room. I think, it's to a big amusement that the girls are finding your pronunciation of my last name, Ubaldo. It is Denim. And but I wouldn't worry about it because it's actually not my last name. Obviously, it's the name of my husband. So sometimes he says that I have trouble pronouncing it the way he pronounces it. So not a big deal, but I see it as a source of amusement in the Hangouts. So I thought I'll bring it out. A couple of comments, general comments on your Hangout. I really liked your session, and particularly Melissa and Ubaldo. I liked how you developed the concepts from the readings around the questions that were relevant to Homeland Security and emergency management. And Melissa, whenever the conversation was running away from the relevant topic, you were bringing it back to make the relevance to discuss those issues in a concept of Homeland Security and emergency management. And the other thing that I have to comment on is, Ubaldo, I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Your experience with leadership, a lack thereof, in your work is, it's a good platform. And I'm sorry you had to go through the experience, because that's certainly the lack of leadership or empathy or the ability to connect to others at the workplace that separates the manager from a leader. And you mentioned that managers, by the virtue of their positions, on their paycheck, that position is reflected in a pay. But there is a fundamental difference, I hope you see by now in your discussions, between the difference between a manager and a leader. One can be a good manager. One can get the things done, correctly, but it's doing the right thing, not the things right, but doing the right thing that separates a manager from the leader. Some managers are good leaders. Some managers are just managers. They just get, the work done in the order that, or in the manner that is prescribed by policy or standard operating procedure. So when we talk about leadership, leadership transcends management. Leadership is this other dimension. It's not to get people to the goal and the outcome, but actually have the people have a vision for what you are doing and believing in that vision and feeling recognized and feeling fulfilled. And that's an art. That is not the administrative skill. That's more of, that higher dimension of having integrated those components of emotional intelligence. And when you talked about the matrix for interviews, how to gauge civility in a workplace, which I thought that Melissa had really good examples, and I'll get to those. And then you talked about the questionnaire that would elicit some of the more of your own thinking, how you solve things. I think your case of the counseling of an employee who has a work problem could be a great example of the test for somebody who is aspiring to a managerial or leadership position, and putting them through the promotional test that will have that type of scenario. You have an employee who is under duress. You have an employee that just experienced a child missing from the home, and to the point where emergency services are involved or law enforcement is involved, and that employee asks for time off. What do? You have a project, or you have a very important timeline that's coming, and it is not in your best interest for that project for the employee to be gone. But at the same time, that employee is experiencing a really critical need. How do you address that situation? And for somebody to actually have to work through that scenario and find ways to where they will be able to reach their goal administratively. At the same time, they would display empathy, social responsibility, and the ability to leverage and connect with others. And so that is a good example of, because, having a survey, are you great, and are you civil, and are you respectful, and are you trustworthy, doesn't show you anything, right? But when you have people problem solve through those issues, that's where those deeper dimensions come out, and scenarios are certainly a really good way to do that. So I'm going to move to some of the aspects of your discussion. So you talked about toxic leadership, lack of concern for others, the conviction that the person is not just working in their own self-interest, but in the interest of others. And the question posed was whether the guy from the nuke them scenario was displaying the traits of a toxic leadership. And Melissa led that discussion, and I think that you hit it on the nail, Melissa, that yes, we do have in some of those organizations like military, or particularly in tactical environments where you have first responders that have to respond, they have to act, they have to do things quickly. Some of them, particularly the more traditional, older professionals that have been there, so to speak, they might have a tendency to bully or be abrupt or be short with people because they need to accomplish that mission. However, the nuke them guy did have the overall vision and mission of others in his lens. So he was not consumed by self-interest. And that's where it would be this differentiation that, you can be a bully and still not be a toxic leader, even though bullying is not good. And generally, in fast-paced events, when the leaders revert to those very tactical decision-making styles, they step on some birds, and they step on some people, and they step on some boundaries. The important thing is to, once you're out of that crisis phase, and once you move out of this critical event, to be able to look back and reflect and think, do I need to address that? Could I have possibly offended some people? Imagine you have nurses and police officers in one scenario, and maybe police officers are used to that tactical decision-making style, but maybe the nurses are not, or epidemiologists, or other people that are going to be in that setting of response. And then they work in totally different environment, of a lot more care and respect, and their leaders are not as tactical. So looking back and being able to say, I am sorry, or having a debrief, or asking for feedback and trying to remedy those, it's extremely difficult to work for people that are always directive, that are always authoritative, even though they are well-intentioned, even though they are not self-centered. It erodes your enjoyment of work. And in the long run, that can be toxic as well. So and I think, Melissa, you had a really good, and Ubaldo chimed in on that discussion as well, that, there is going to be some circumstances where those type of qualities will come out. But if they are prevalent in the organization, that organization is not being led. Maybe it is managed, but it's not being led. And the true job satisfaction comes from good leadership, not necessarily just good management. You can manage people well, you can be a pretty lousy leader where they don't buy into your vision, where, they do the work because that's what's required of them, but they don't feel gratitude. They don't feel vested in that project. They eventually leave somewhere else, hopefully to make better contributions somewhere else. So, then, you moved on to talk about specific areas of toxic leadership. And Melissa mentioned that model of kissing up and kicking down, and that's prevalent in hierarchical organizations. And that's going to be prevalent in your homeland security and emergency management, because in bureaucracies, you're going to have those levels of command. And some organizations and some workplaces are going to be flatter, where there's a lot more decision making in the middle level or lower level of the organization. And in some instances, it's going to be up to that, looking up to for power and higher ups and the next promotion and stuff like that. So certainly it is detrimental when you do not seek the feedback from the troops, so to speak, when you're just relying in your performance evaluations on the feedback of your supervisors. And the really good instrument to institute in work environments, it's called a 360 feedback. 360 feedback, and you have that in your reading in your readings, I believe, in the next module. 360 feedback is where the employee performance is not only assessed by the higher ups, but it's also assessed by the people underneath you. So then you get a much better picture of, what people that are your subordinates, what their concerns are. And the 360 feedback is not necessarily for, the get you thing, to try to do disciplinary action or base promotion on that. But 360 is more a diagnostic. So you can measure yourself in the organization because, I would argue that nobody wants to be a bad manager. Nobody comes to work with a definite statement that I am going to mess up the lives of the people that work for me the best that I can. Most of the problems with that is lack of awareness and lack of awareness of what people are thinking, at the lower level. So I thought that was a really good point that Melissa made. And I think that you also said that it truly matters the most what the people that you are managing are thinking or leading, and hopefully both, not necessarily your superiors. Yes, this is your career progression, but you're not going to progress very far in your organization unless it's a toxic organization, and you don't want to be in it anyway if it's toxic. But you're not going to get very far if you don't have the support from people below you. And those informal leaders below you are sometimes extremely influential. The informal leaders that might not have a rank, they are the horse whisperers. They are the ones that can make or break the workplace as well. So if you don't have the support of the troops, you can have sabotage. You can have people doing things, that are passively defying the purpose without you being aware of it. So that's really, really critical. Feedback is really important, and realizing that you need it. We don't like criticism. Nobody likes a criticism or a critique. And, when you look at evaluations, when I look at evaluations and, I want to see good things. And if I see a bad thing, it bothers me. But if it's a constructive comment, then I can improve something the next time. If somebody just says, class was horrible, whatever, disorganized, and I hated it, and gives me a 1 or 2 out of 5, I've got nothing to go on to improve it for next time. But if somebody says, I would have done it this way, or I would suggest doing this, or I recommend that, then it's a constructive something that even though you see that criticism, you can relate to it. You can see how you can improve next time. So it's really valuable. And we're not talking specifically about feedback in this session. We're talking about toxic leadership, but certainly feedback is part of it. Ubaldo, you were mentioning the directive decision-making or directive style that is prevalent in the military. You just told, what you need to do, and you do it because that's the mission. And it's, as you mentioned, directive leadership style is called for in certain circumstances. And one of your theories and presentations was on situational leadership. And situational leadership takes 2 axes into account. One is the experience and one is motivation. And based on those 2 dimensions, you can sort of structure how you manage people and how you lead people. And so if you have people that are without experience and without motivation, you have to direct them or let them go. If you have people that are highly motivated and not very experienced, you cannot do the laissez-faire with them. You cannot let them be, because they need coaching, they need mentoring. If you've got people that are both motivated and highly experienced, You laissez-faire, you let them go, you let them do your thing. So based on experience and motivation in those 4 dimensions, a good leader will diagnose what type of style they need to be approached with. Do I need to direct them, or do I need to shore them up a little bit? Or do I need to let them be? Or maybe I have somebody very, very experienced but's got no motivation. Somebody like that, if I direct, they're not going to do anything. Somebody like that, if I try to coach them, they are probably not going to do anything because they are experienced. Somebody like that requires a participatory decision-making style, to where you sit down and you try to diagnose what is it that made you lose the motivation along the way. Is there something that you would rather be doing that we can come up with a different project? So you see, I agree with you on this situational aspect, and directive has place in some areas with some employees. But certainly, if you are highly motivated, Ubaldo, and you're not lazy, right, as you mentioned, then the directive is offensive, it's aggressive, it's oppressive, and it's not needed truly. And it just causes friction in the organization. And you're right, there are different ways of saying things. You can tell somebody that they didn't do the good job, or you can tell somebody, my suggestions for you to do a job better are this, and that. And that's certainly a different approach, and it's a lot more effective. If you tell somebody they are rubbish at something, that's not very constructive. Where are they going to go from this? If you tell somebody that those are the areas, highlighted areas that you want them to work on for whatever reasons, and you sit down with them, that's a lot more effective. So, I think, Melissa, you were talking about the issues of fellowships. That was from the video, how toxic leadership affects the fellowship, and the fellowship impacts the overall well-being of the organization. And you link that to Homeland Security and emergency management, and you indicated the dimensions of Homeland Security and emergency management being dealing with complexity, uncertainty, and unpredictability. And in those type of environments, when that fellowship is gone and the trust is gone, then risky decisions are difficult. Because if you have to put your life on the line for somebody you don't trust, or if you have to go on a limb and make a decision that's very risky, you're going to do it if you have that sense of esprit de corps or fellowship, as you mentioned. If you don't, then there's miscommunication, then the communication breakdowns. And as we know, communications are the first things to go in any crisis, right? In any disaster. And you can have all the technologies in the world, but if you do not have that human aspect of interoperability, then you have an issue in Homeland Security and emergency management, again, in unpredictable situations. So fairness and fellowship is really important in both organizations. There are some organizations where you don't need fellowshipping, where you don't need that bond, because maybe the projects you're working on are independent, are not connected, and there are no high consequences of your job. There are no in Homeland Security and emergency management is a little bit different than AGB, and I hope that you agree with me. Not that one job is more important than the other, but the consequences are different. The consequences of one, failure might be unhappy customer and financial losses, right? And effect of overall productivity. The consequences in high life risk situations are deaths. And lives being lost potentially, in addition to the financial impact that, we worry about the financial, hopefully, after we worry about life saving and life safety. And so the trust and that erosion of trust is really, really critical. No, not critical, but detrimental in those environments. And then you looked at those factors, and you had a little bit of a difficulty there on trying to tease out, if you had to pick one of those factors of toxic leadership or characteristics of toxic leaders, which one was the worst and why? And specifically, you talked about destructiveness, you talked about bullying, and you talked about you had to compare, would you rather be in Homeland Security and emergency management, again, because this is what our course is about. It's not about, if you're not in a current position, Homeland Security and emergency management, you should project what it would be like in those environments. So bully or laissez-faire. And I loved the fact that you actually, Ubaldo and Melissa, you went and you checked the definition of laissez-faire, because, how can you pick if you don't know the definition? The whole world starts with definitions of concepts, right? So I'm glad you did your research on that. And you're right, laissez-faire is a style of leadership usually by experienced people who assume that everybody knows what they know, everybody is as experienced as they are, and they just let them be. And they let them do their thing. It does not work in every circumstance, and it certainly is very detrimental in crisis. And Melissa, you eventually unpacked it, and you and Ubaldo, I think you had the back and forth on the laissez-faire issue, because you said, I'd much rather have a bully in that type of scenario. Let's say we are working through the triage and somebody barks at me. Well, I can get over this. I can, somebody steps on me. Well, hurt feelings. Good, I can deal with that later. But if somebody totally dismisses me, doesn't seek my input, I don't feel encouraged because they don't care, they just move along, they don't support you, they're not there, that could be detrimental in decision making, because you might have that one good idea that person didn't think about. And I am absolutely agreeing with that laissez-faire in organizations of high unpredictability is a very poor management style, and it's definitely a poor leadership style. And I think, Ubaldo, you were talking about not being ignored. You had a little bit different interpretation of laissez-faire, let it be, let it do. Yes, and you brought it up to that. If somebody is motivated and they know what they are doing, let them do. And I agree with that. At the same time, between the bully and the laissez-faire in crisis, you probably want somebody that's more invested, even if they, and hopefully they don't, but if they do bark at you or, are nuke them type of personality, then you can address it later and say, listen, I did not appreciate how you talked to me. I did not like it. It offended me. And they probably don't realize what they're doing either. A lot of those very tactical leaders are unaware of what kind of impact some of the words they're saying have on others. So it takes a lot of courage a lot of times in organizations to confront the situation, but not in the middle of a situation in crisis, right? You don't want to do it right there and then. You don't want to have a pissing contest when the lives are at stake. But that's a time in after action reports, after action reviews, evaluations. You go back and you say, listen, I really did not like the way you handled that. And there is a better way to do that. You can resolve that later. And certainly with laissez-faire, once that opportunity is missed on making some critical decision or looking over your shoulder and making sure that, this person supports you or cooperates with you, collaborates with you, versus just doing their own thing and assuming that you are doing the right thing, then you have miscommunication. See, a lot of miscommunications happen based on assumptions that the people know what they're supposed to do. And a case in point was during LA riots when the chief of police, Daryl Gates, if you remember LA riots, the chief of police, Daryl Gates, he was looking at the situation evolving with a verdict in Rodney King beating could have been 50% yes, 50% no, right? So you have either or. It could have ended bad or it could have ended good. And unfortunately, those officers were not, they were not found guilty, and that caused all those riots. Well, the police chief assumed that his troops and his people know what they're supposed to do, and he went to the banquet. 2 hours later, the city was on fire. So he was laissez-faire, but it was such a complex situation that he did not adapt a proper leadership style in that situation, if you get with me on that. So again, situational leadership will depend on the maturity of an employee, the motivation levels of an employee, and overall risk situation. What is the risk of somebody, behaving or not behaving a certain way. Then you had the whole discussion on the narratives of toxic leaders, the most common narratives. And again, Melissa and Ubaldo, you had some really good examples here. Attack on follower self-esteem. There was one that Melissa brought about, and I found that example really, really interesting because it deals with a matter of preference styles for people, which is measured by so-called Myers-Briggs questionnaire. If you have ever heard about Myers-Briggs, or if you haven't, check it out. It's Myers-Briggs, Myers, M-E-Y-E-R-S, Briggs with 2 G's. It was developed by the mother and daughter. It's a psychometric instrument that looks at different personalities and preferences. And it looks at how people have preferences for drawing energy, for their actions, how they make decisions, how they, what is their future orientation, and how they communicate. And one of those dimensions in Myers-Briggs, one of the 4 dimensions, is introversy versus extroversy. So extrovert, introvert dimension. And for any good leaders or managers, they should take Myers-Briggs, because in every organization, you're going to have people who fall on the spectrum of extroverts and introverts. And in every organization, you need both, because the way people prefer to think and to speak and to act reflects their preference. That is innate, right? That is, Melissa, you described it as your personality. And the difference between introverts and extroverts, and we might have discussed that, but I just really want to bring it out, is that the introverts are the ones that give depth to life. The extroverts bring breadth to life. The depth, because the introverts usually draw energy from within. They are analytical. They like to take the information in and process it themselves before they process it through others. So they are very, very internally focused. The introverts sometimes seem aloof. They seem not engaged. They seem to be loners, but it's not that. They are not those things. It's just that the way they process information. So, and you can perfectly see that with Melissa, because, when Melissa comes to discuss something, she's already thought about it, reflected on it, analyzed it. She's used her internal locus of, center of gravity, so to speak, and then she will talk. While the extroverts give breath to life. They're exuberant. They speak before they think sometimes, and they can come across as shallow, but they're not. It's just how they draw energy. They need others. They need others to think. They need the interaction and others' input and others' opinions. So they are more externally focused. They seem loud, they seem noisy, they seem too much sometimes for introverts. Whereas to extroverts, the introverts seem, to be withdrawn or maybe not having input. But both groups of people in a workplace complement one another. So for your manager, in your case, Melissa, to tell you that you're an introvert, it's stating the obvious. Yes, that's your preference style. That's how you think. If she was ever tested on Myers-Briggs questionnaire, or, if that developmental tool was available in your organization, and you might eventually, in the future discuss that with her, she would realize that, not everybody processes information the same way or analyzes stuff. And perhaps what you're currently doing does not fit your preference style. Maybe there are some other areas of your work where you would be better suited, more analytical parts of your work, or maybe in some areas, the extroverts are preferred, but that doesn't mean that they're not valuable people. And so what you said about how, you started thinking about yourself as being an introvert, and as that is some kind of bad thing, that's really awful. That's bad leadership style. Because it is okay to be an introvert. That's who you are, right? That's how you process information. That's how you are wired. So, she did hire you. after all, right? So now it's incumbent upon that manager to have that awareness of, your employees' preferences and put them in situations where they will succeed and not where they will fail. And you mentioned some very, very alarming characteristics on a failed threat, right? She didn't say you will lose the job, you better shape up or ship out. So it wasn't a direct threat because that would be hostility in a workplace, but it was veiled threat. It was subliminal. It causes you to have anxiety. It causes you to doubt yourself. It causes you to have a lower self-esteem. And that's really bad. I think your example is very representative of how apparently at the management levels in your organization, those developmental tools are not available to those people, because if they knew about those different dimensions of people in the workplace, some people are procrastinators. That's another dimension. Some people are so-called P and some people are J. So perceiving versus judging. And again, Mayor Briggs is quite complicated, but the ones that are perceiving, they tend to put things to the last minute because they do a lot of conceptualizations. They hate micromanaging. They hate people coming into the office and saying, have you done that? Have you done that? Because they don't work in a very step-by-step manner like J people do. J, the judging people, they have to have benchmarks. They have to, before they get to the deadline, they have to have progress reports, check marks, and all that. Whereas the Ps, they tend to think about it a lot and then they do it at the very end and they come through at the end. So they just approach the tasks differently. The most important thing is, are you done at the end? Can you deliver a product? Of course, procrastination sometimes leads to lack of performance, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking to the people that perform, but in a different way. So different style micromanaging for them would be detrimental, where laissez-faire for judging people would be horrible, because they expect to have progress checks. They want, because that's how they work, that's how they are wired. So again, trying to fit one style to a particular preference of an employee is really important. And I think that those kind of assessments are really, really critical in organizations. And so, again, that could cause self-doubt. And Melissa, you went through the period of self-doubt and, being worried about it and being worried what, once that label gets on, what other people can think. And it's all about education. It's about letting people know that, there are extroverts and there are introverts, and they are, there are different variety of people that have different preferences. If you had to paint your perfect vacation, Melissa, I would assume that your perfect vacation picture would be a hammock, a tree, a mountain, a book, something that is not full of cocktails and lots of people and kids running around and the ship coming into the port and people pouring out. Because again, this is a preference of introverts versus extroverts, how they draw their energy, how they re-energize. They prefer to be left with their thoughts, versus the extroverts, put them on a hammock with a book on the mountain, and they're going to go crazy because they need that noise. They need that interaction. So, Ubaldo, I'm going to get to your case. So in your case, you all said that, you're supposed to leave your personal issues at home. And when you come to work, you should have your mind clear to work. And certainly, that is a management principle, right? You have an outcome of your job and there is a product of a job. And this is where emotional intelligence comes in. Not all about work is checklists and procedures and outcomes. We do bring different life issues to our work. And hopefully we can resolve them, or we can seek help to resolve them. But hopefully we also have organizations that are mindful of that human factor. And in your case, it's a horrible case. And, I wasn't aware when you were in a class in the summer that you were going through that. But that lack of support when, it's not a very arbitrary issue. It's not some kind of, I need to go on a cruise because I have a ticket. It's something that is really, really critical in the organization. A good supervisor, a good leader would sit down and try to figure out if there are ways to get a replacement, get somebody cover up for you, have somebody else do that project while you can be cleared off and you can take care, because an employee whose mind is fixated on a drama or issue at home cannot be productive anyway. So it is totally non-effective to force somebody to stay while there is a fire burning in their home. And this is very critical with emergency management as well, because think about those issues of police officers in New Orleans. Police officers in New Orleans were berated, and they were criticized, and they were, so to speak, thrown under the bus for leaving their positions in Katrina, for leaving their squad cars, and going home and leaving with their families. And now think about that. What would you do as a good leader? As a good leader in the organization, police chief of the New Orleans Police Department would have a process on what to do with shift changes, how to arrange for those officers before the hurricane hit to secure the families, to evacuate their families, to take care of them before they came to work. And that those processes were not present there. So there was no surprise when you look at human behavior that those people, when they have to choose between work and between their wives and kids and families being stuck in the rising waters, that they're going to abandon their posts. But we were very quick to judge that police department, but the police department had a total lack of leadership in making sure that you prepare those people that they're going to be going through emotional stress and duress, and they need to handle things on a home front first before they are ready to do the work for the public. And we should not have those expectations that they will sacrifice their own families for somebody else. Now, it's noble to have those expectations, but it's against human nature. And, and your case, Ubaldo, is just really, really highlights that. And I am glad in a way that you were able to resolve it, but I'm really sorry that you had to go through that. And certainly, you have a good supervisor now, and I'm very glad that you knew what kind of processes to start and initiate not to tolerate that type of behavior. And, if it was a different organization, horribly, things could have ended up with disciplinary action against you as well. So it's a good thing that those processes actually kicked in, and that type of behavior was not tolerated. I think that the discussion you had on emotional agility, and I'm really glad that you picked that up from the readings, and then you unpacked your situation based on that, is it's very important to break down those processes when you have resentment, when you are offended, when you are not recognized, when your feelings get hurt, and do that analysis based on those different criteria, how you unpack that, and see, acknowledge, that you are angry. Look at all the circumstances, try to sort through that. And so acknowledging is the first part. When we do not acknowledge an issue, or we hold that resentment, Joseph Conrad, a really known writer, who wrote The Heart of Darkness, if you've ever read that, he said that resentments are like little coffins that we put in ourselves, but eventually they pop up to the surface. And Melissa, you talked about bottling things up, right? We can suck it up and we can bottle it up. But what happens in those environments where, emotional agility allows us to have some natural defenses against chronic stress and PTSD. None of you mentioned PTSD, but that's exactly what it is. It's the inability to process all those hard, toxic feelings that happened. And particularly in military environments, in homeland security and emergency management environments, police officers or emergency responders are supposed to be tough. We're supposed to, be 16 feet tall and jump through, from one roof to the next. And yet the things that they deal with every day, accumulate a lot of resentment and a lot of anger and a lot of stuff that they deal with. So eventually those erode your health and, your emotional well-being. So recognizing the emotional agility, instituting a process at the workplace by managers and leaders is very important. Those would be all the group discussions, debriefing sessions when something goes wrong, when there is a conflict in the workplace, and you're going to have conflict in every workplace. How the leader approaches that. They sweep it under the carpet, nobody complained, nobody said anything, well, we can move on. We are here to do the job. We're not going to be crying over spilled milk. But things affect people. So having a debrief session, on what you've seen, on, something that didn't go very well. And again, I'm bringing it to the environment of crisis management, right? Or homeland security events, security and safety events. There are going to be decisions that are going to be bad. There are going to be issues you can't resolve. There are going to be conflicts, again, in those very high stress, high risk situations. And that's why debriefing, post-event counseling is so critical. Because one person, and Melissa, you said that as well, one person, it's very hard for one person to resolve all their, conflict themselves as well. It's usually very helpful in a group setting. And it should be part of the whole organizational culture that people can speak up and they can bring those issues to the table. So the last question on civility, wanted your group to come up with specific 6 strategies to weed out among applicants, the elements of incivility or civility, because most of the, job applications don't really cut it, right? And incivility is so rampant in a workplace. And so I particularly liked the group interview suggestion that you had, Melissa. And in a group interview, you will have those different personalities, right? So if you have an interview for a job, more likely than not, you're not going to have all extroverts, for example. You're going to have somebody that's an introvert. So if you do a group interview and somebody says, well, this person, they're going to be aloof at the workplace, you might be able to chime in and say, well, but what I really liked is this other dimension of that person. And then if you have a group interview, you also don't have these issues of power later on. I hired you and, I'm so disappointed because that's not what I expected, because it's a group decision making for the whole organization. You bring people with different expectations. And also in a group interview, you can everybody has a different interviewing style. So you can bring out some things from people and you can see how they deal with stress of 3 people interviewing them, or if they get short, if they get upset about something, you can tell this a lot better than in one-on-one. So that was a really good point. And the one that is truly excellent, one of the most effective ways of measuring that is through scenarios and simulations. And simulations are better than scenarios and tabletops, but simulations are a lot more expensive, or a lot more resources, and a lot more involved. However, they are the most effective, because you said yourself, in those different environments, you're working with different people, right? The nurses have different expectations. The athletics have different expectations. The security students have different way of looking at things. And how you work in that group will show you what kind of conflict could emerge. And you can see how within that conflict, the people deal with stress or conflict. Do they have that emotional intelligence that you want them to have, and those skills to get upset, leave the group and, throw the towel in and, nobody listened to me and so on, or they are trying to work through the issue. If they come back later and have a good comment or a good suggestion for something. So those are really, really excellent. Tabletops are good too. So any scenarios, tell me about one time that you had to resolve this or that, or here's a situation. Again, I'm going to Ubaldo's story. Here's this employee. It's a valued employee. There's never been any problem with that employee. That employee needs to go home. But you have that deadline. What do you do? Well, I need to meet the deadline. I have a project. They need to leave things at home. Now, that might be a red flag for you when hiring somebody, or that somebody might need additional counseling, additional training, additional professional development. It doesn't necessarily mean maybe you're not going to hire them, but at least you're going to diagnose how they act in those environments. So scenarios are really excellent. Ubaldo, you brought about questionnaires, but as you were talking, because I was trying to think about surveys and questionnaires, if they're on the Likert scale, as Mia talked about, from agree to disagree, they're not very indicative of anything. You actually have to gauge behaviors, and people are not very critical about their own behaviors, right? They will tell you they're the best leader, they're the best problem solver. You just want to see the evidence of that. Just because somebody put on a resume is a great problem solver is not enough. Show me that you are a great problem solver. Give me a problem to solve. And those are usually, they will they'll work out some people out of the competition because they don't have evidence, because they don't have a good example, or their example is going to indicate that there are some issues there. They will show the way they will solve that problem, and it's suddenly, it's obvious that that's not the right way to handle it. So I agree with situational stuff. I don't know if it would be questionnaires or it would be more of the situations or a session, or, tell me about a time in your life where you had to deal with difficult people. What did you do? Tell me about a time in your life where you had to make a decision that was between, reporting on somebody that did something in the organization where it would risk you to get in trouble with some other employees. Are you going to do it or not going to do it? And now you're going to see how they unpack that. So those are really, really good strategies. Now, you were supposed to come up with 6. I think that, those 3 are really good. I encourage you to think about some of the ones, because you're going to be eventually going for those jobs, and you will be eventually getting those jobs. But what is more important, you are going to be promoting within those organizations within the next 5 or 10 years. And with millennials, it's probably going to be a faster career progression than it used to be in the past, because everything is more fast-paced. And because, we expect those promotional levels to be quicker. It used to be that somebody was a police officer for 10 or 15 years before they even could consider applying for a sergeant position, for example, where now, young professionals want to progress much faster. So you are eventually going to be put in those positions where you're going to have to reflect, what are you going to expect in that organization at the job interview? How are you going to structure it? What type of people you're going to surround yourself with? You're going to be responsible for diagnosing those issues and problems and the red flags. So I think it's very important to keep thinking through those things as you are going through your professional life journey. And, hopefully, if you are in a toxic environment, a lot of times, at some point you have to make a decision. Do you just stay on the job and you get what they call assigned in place or retired in place? Do you just do it because, it's the money and the paycheck at the end of the day? Or do you try to find a place that is more nurturing? And I think as you hit the workplace, the companies will have to really reinvent themselves with how they treat the issue of incivility in the workplace, because this new generation like yourself is not very tolerant of that. My generation or generation before me, we used to deal with a lot of it and not ever talk about it. And, leadership was, always assumed as being from the position of power. And only in recent years, we see more of those development programs. And the important thing is, none of it is supposed to be punitive. When you manage people, you are trying to focus not on their weaknesses, because everybody has those. You're trying to see what strengths they have and in what ways those strengths can be nurtured. So again, going back to Melissa's case, an introvert who is more a depth person and analytical and takes time for reflection would be better suited to certain things in the organizations versus others. We can't be great at everything. there is no workplace where you have an ideal employee. Everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses. A good leader is looking at those really good things that they can anchor on and build their employees too. Now, again, good manager and good leader, two different things. You can be a good manager and not be a tremendous leader. You certainly cannot be a good leader if you are not that great of a manager. But it's ideal to have both, to have somebody that will ensure that the job priorities are met, that the outcomes are crossed and checked, and the bottom line is ensured for the agency, that they also have that ability to grow people, to push people up, to mentor people, to not cut their opportunities, to not threaten them. And I think we all should expect, our working environments to be supportive of that. So I enjoyed that discussion that you had. Again, just fix the camera work on the next one. And thank you for your session. And I will see you on the last one.